Hi, I'm Jesse Hirsh, and I'm here with my good friend Allan Gregg for another episode of the Red-Tory podcast, coming to you on what should be a statutory holiday here in Canada. I was actually in line at the polling booth, which is rare. It's the first time I've voted in our tiny rural riding where there was a lineup. And the poll workers did confirm that they've never seen so many people.
Oh, wow.
But the chat was, this should be a holiday. This was too nice a day to go back to work to, worry about such things. But alas, at this point, that isn't the case. Nonetheless, we start every episode with me throwing to you, Alan, and saying, what have you been paying attention to? What's caught your eye?
Well, on election day, you can't help but watch the election. I mean, both in terms of I went voting this morning as well. There was virtually no one in my polling booth. Interesting that the unprecedented advance polls, but it's polling. One of the limitations we always talk about, we cannot predict behavior in the absence of events that will engender behavior, and that means things like turnout. I mean, I can tell you, if turnout is 60%, who are the ones who are most likely to vote? If it's 70%, who are the most likely to vote? If it's 50%, but I can't tell you if it's going to be 60, 70, or 50. I have no idea. So I mean, there's a lot of speculation that there could be very high turnout. So I'm obviously going to watch tonight too. I also think it's going to be closer than a lot of people recognize. I mean, I saw a poll the other day, a private poll, and while it had the Liberals ahead by a couple points, as all the ones on the weekend did. So some very surprising subgroup breaks. I mean, that Conservatives leading among blue-collar voters by 20%, leading among Sikh and Hindu voters by double-digit numbers. That makes ridings like in Vancouver Island, for example, where the NDP are vulnerable, look an awful lot like they might go Tory. Similarly, ridings like the Brampton and the Burnabys, where you have high Indian population, could be as well. But the other thing that's been striking me over this week, and that's not a big story, but it's clearly a story, is what's happening with the United States and Ukraine, Russia right now, and these continued threats to walk back any involvement in this terrible kind of atrocity and dilemma. And the interesting part is not just what America might do, but if America did walk back, what that would do to Europe. And depending on what it would do with Europe and what it would be most likely to do with Europe would be unified even further and cause what has been a significant increase in the commitment to military defense of their continent to even escalate further. And also will have impacts back on the trade issue, because the more unified EU is as a bloc, as they are supposed to be, the more they're going to be able to wield the influence of an economy that collectively is as powerful as the United States. So looking at that as well, and wondering whether, again, this is just a red flag that the Trump administration is waving, or whether it's something that is really real and that they're just saying we can't do anything here and they're going to walk away.
Well, and to your point, I think Europe, and for lack of a better phrase, the rest of the responsible international community are concerned about what's going on right now in
Oh yeah.
Ukraine, and the way in which it could, and this is such a cliche, it could spiral out of control in terms of becoming a larger regional conflict. And I think you called it originally that Trump is motivated by some vanity here, that he genuinely believes he'll get a Nobel Prize
Oh yeah.
if he can deliver peace. I'm skeptical as to whether he can, because I think Putin is playing all of them. Like, I still am the person who doesn't think that Trump is specifically a Russian asset. But I do think Russia's a very savvy player. And they take advantage of chaos, and they take advantage of anyone they have to deal with. And Sergei Lavrov, the foreign affairs minister of Russia, was on the Washington Sunday morning shows this week.
Yeah, amazing.
Which is absurd. Like, this is, again, masterclass in Russian statecraft. That if it works out, great. I think everyone wants to see at least the cessation of hostilities and some, ability for Ukraine to try to rebuild and recalibrate. But to your point, I think this is a really important story internationally because it ties to trade. And in particular, because we could be seeing a resurgent Europe and a Europe, especially if it remains on the opposite political pole, whatever that means, whether the center or the center left of America, then it becomes another counterbalance to this changing geopolitical order, which I think is crucial.
And the end of the United States is the bedrock of NATO.
Yeah.
So it does stand to have significant repercussions on the total world order beyond what is happening tragically in Ukraine and Russia right now.
Well, and let me put a little footnote there, only because this was something I was reading right before we connected. Because the situation in Gaza and Israel and the Middle East is the other kind of volatile dumpster fire that's going on. And I picked up this new insight that deep down I sort of knew about, but I haven't thought about for years. And it's the divide within Israeli society between the ultra-Orthodox and, the largely secular population. And where it is currently hitting ahead is historically the ultra-Orthodox were exempt from the draft. They were exempt from military service. They passed a law a couple of years ago removing that because it was a huge political issue. But still, like less than 3% of ultra-Orthodox members of the Israeli state actually comply. Yeah. So because of the nature of how this conflict is drawing on, because of the morale and the toll it's taken on the IDF, this is becoming a huge political issue. And the other dynamic of this that I didn't realize, and I'm saying all this because I'm Jewish, because I understand globally the dynamics between the ultra-Orthodox and the non-ultra-Orthodox, is like the average ultra-Orthodox family is 12 kids. Mm. And they've been doing this for 3-4 decades now in Israel. They're almost at 50% of the population. So they're no longer a minority. Like, they have been the explosive population growth in an otherwise kind of Western democracy where you don't have the same level. Like, so this is a whole other side of this political dynamic that I was oblivious to that I find fascinating.
Where the argument against the two-state solution has often been that Israelis will end up in the minority because of the population growth in the Arab population versus the Israeli. Now, I did the 1988 election for Shimon Peres in Israel and pulled out every trick I had ever learned and did not change one vote. Yeah. In no small measure because of that huge divide between the Orthodox and the Reform community. There was no accommodation whatsoever possible. I was working for labor at the time, and that these are all Ashkenazi Jews, who would say, if we don't understand how important it is to have a homeland, if we don't understand how important it is to protect minority rights, who in the world should land for peace? And the Orthodox response was, "Fuck you."
Yeah.
My uncle got killed by an Arab. That was the end of the conversation.
Well, and it creates, at least for me, this mirror towards American politics where you have this growing force of right-wing religious zealots who are driving a lot of state policy in no small part because of demographics. And going back, shifting to the Canadian context due to mobilization. Because that is where, in the Canadian election, I think regardless of the outcome, and as you know, I'm in a very Tory riding. So if you were to ask me today what my impressions are based on my community, I would say the Tories are going to win. Like, they are so enthusiastic. They're so mobilized, right? Like, the Liberals are mobilized too. There's a lot of people, pulling for Carney because this is a retired civil servant community as well. But honestly, the extent to which the Tories are really galvanized, really mobilized, means I almost feel like where I woke up on the U.S. election day and thought, oh, I think Kamala's going to win today. I almost feel that there's that same sense. And you said something that's really key that I want to tease out. I think a lot of Canadians treat our election and treat polling as if it's national when it is very regional.
Yeah.
And very riding by riding. Like, even though nationally it's neck and neck, there's some ridings that are going to be so overwhelmingly Tory or so overwhelmingly liberal that it doesn't balance out.
Yeah, no, and often regional trends will not translate directly at the riding level. We saw that very much in the Ontario election, where the NDP were able to withstand what was a significant shift away from the unpopular vote and hardly lost a seat because people really liked their incumbents. And who knows, that may translate again as well.
Hmm. And this goes to, I kind of want to tie this to something you said in terms of the polling numbers of how the Tories fundamentally are kind of the same people they went into this elect. Like they didn't really win anyone over, at
Yeah,
least,
and they
you
didn't
know,
lose much either.
but that's the key. They
Yeah.
didn't lose any either. And it strikes me that if they get walloped, if the Liberals, due to first past the post, win a majority, a really strong majority, I think there's going to be a real stinging alienation amongst conservatives who, in their world, amongst their friends, in their social circle, nothing changed.
Well, they
Like
lost.
this,
They lost the 2019 and the 2021 election, having won the popular vote. And that translates roughly from pundit talk that the liberal vote is more efficient because you don't have this big pockets of uncontested conservative votes in rural Canada that the conservatives have right now. So you're right. I mean, if they win the popular vote again and lose seats, and if you have a fourth term liberal government, and this is the warning of Preston Manning and the demands that are being put forward by the Danielle Smith, Premier of Alberta, that alienation, first within the conservative population, but more localized within Western Canada, is quite likely to be further agitated.
especially when you combine this with the media consumption habits,
Mm.
that there is a clear demarcation in this election between, the center left that's stuck with your CBC, CTV, Globe and Mail, and the conservative base, some of whom may still have been consuming mainstream media, but they're listening to Pam Wallen, right? They're listening to a direct, quote unquote, independent media, and it's, at least from what I'm seeing, especially in my community, it's completely different narratives, completely different messaging, completely different political discussion.
But you have, in addition to maybe different media consumption, I think even more important, you have different worldviews. And I don't mean that
Yes.
as just in terms of international affairs, in terms of how people are looking at the world outside of their window.
Yeah.
And there's an old maxim in politics, and it's before kind of what is the ballot question, is find an issue and make it your issue. What's your area of strength? And then try to drive up the salience of that. So the NDP, just as an example, their area of strength is healthcare. So this is the reason that Jagmeet Singh is talking about healthcare. If he could make healthcare the overriding ballot question in the election, would have a real good chance of winning. What you see now, the polarization is in terms of, and where it's most stark, and we talked about this a little bit before, is age. Is when you ask what's the most important issue in this election, the one that's most likely to cause you to decide how to vote. You look at the people who say it's Donald Trump and tariffs. Those who are under 30, only 13% are saying that. Those who are over 60% are saying that.
Yeah.
So you've got one population who's concerned about immediate problems that are very tangible and real, and who have a historical grievance. And these are the people who are overwhelmingly voting for Pierre Poilievre.
And that's your working class vote.
It's working class. It's those who feel vulnerable
Yeah.
in society, those who feel left behind,
Yeah.
those who feel disrespected, those who feel the system isn't working
Yeah.
for them, or in the instance of young people who actually believe the system's working against them. But then you've got on the other side, people whose focus is very much on future uncertainty, not past grievances, and what they're looking for is stability. They don't want a disruptor. They want a calm manager. And this is the whole competence versus character argument that we've seen. And what we've seen in the last week is it hasn't been a huge shift, but there has been a 10-point shift in the percentage who say what is the most important issue, focusing my attention, is the more abstract tariff issues, versus the more concrete cost of living kind of issues. And in fact, that the latter is now ahead in that. And this is why you've seen the polls close a little bit, and why there's a prospect of it being significantly tighter than it certainly looked a week ago. And then all the weekend pollsters just said, well, it has tightened up a little bit, but every one of them, the 9, predicted a Liberal majority. I'm not so sure.
And this is why I really loved last episode, and I ended up turning around and ripping off a Substack post about how people lie to pollsters.
Oh, you.
Because I think that there are a lot of people in Canada who would lie to the pollster saying that they'll vote Liberal when really they're going to vote Conservative. And I say this because in more centrist, and I'm using ideological terms when really it's more cultural, but in centrist communities, the Liberals are really shaming the Tories, like tremendously so. And I'm not saying the Tories don't do their own dehumanizing of their Liberal opponents. It does happen, but it happens in ways that I see more, because you mentioned this, and we've seen this in terms of people not acknowledging that they'll vote for Trump.
Right.
I think there is a similar tendency here in Canada, that there are people who will not publicly admit that they are going to vote Tory. There's will.
There's some of that. It's called social desirability. I mean, I remember in the 1980s and early 1990s, we had a terrible time ever finding anyone who said they were going to vote social credit in Alberta or BC, because it was a party on the wane. And if you're still clinging to that vote, you were deemed to be kind of a troglodyte. And there's no question that Liberals and progressives have had a tendency to demonstrably look down their nose at anyone who disagrees with them, which causes the people who disagree with them to even be more alienated from them than they would if they just had a civil conversation about ideas, where there would be one level of disagreement. But when they get this kind of, effete snobbery that's going out, that just intensifies that much more.
And to reinforce your point, this came in a particular group chat where everyone was like, yeah, I can't even talk to conservatives. And then I'm more of a lurker in this community. And I came in and said, well, I live in a community where everyone's a conservative, and I have to be talking to them because that's how one engages in the community. And then went on to explain it's actually quite difficult. It's actually quite easy. You just got to find things in common, right? Yeah. Like it's really quite simple. And the response from a lot of people is like, yeah, well, I'm not going to do that. Right? Like it is this real thing. Like it's become this politicized thing of we have to convert people rather than, no, you don't have to persuade anyone. Just connect with them as a human. Before I forget though, I want to circle back to something else you said. And I don't want to lose the NDP in this discussion because I'm pissed. And at some point I'm going to put this behind me. But your point about the NDP's focus on healthcare is logical, but I think doomed. And I say this because throughout our podcast, like I think we're on episode 27 or 28 maybe, you've thrown out a bunch of really phenomenal, crazy policy ideas, like paying, teachers $250,000 a year, right? Or like, and these, again,
forcing large corporations to have daycare in-house.
Right. Like, again, it would be easy for us in an episode, and I'm not suggesting we do this at any point soon, to come up with an NDP platform that would be way better than the NDP's platform,
for sure.
Right? That would get attention versus, I think you're exactly right. I think they looked at polling. They said healthcare is the one issue that will better perform at. But like, what are they going to say to distinguish themselves in the world of healthcare? Like, it's all incrementalist.
Yes.
Versus they need to find an area where they can make a radical leap, distinguish themselves completely.
The Liberals say we should have $12 a day daycare. The NDP say $10. The Liberals said we should have 2 drugs covered under a pharmacare plan. The NDP says 3. I mean, big deal. But you're right. It's way too little, way too late in an environment where people believe that there are huge consequences, of which the NDP don't really have a big stake in the game one way or the other.
Now, I wanted to circle back to my point about media consumption, and I think you're correct to rethink of it as worldview, because worldview not only encompasses kind of what they see out their window, but their values.
Yeah.
And as we know from our good friend George Lakoff, values drive politics, and especially ballot box politics. Because I kind of feel that in the the feedback circuit loops that existed, the liberal one Carney was very effective at basically appropriating any agenda that the Tories or NDP would have.
Mhm.
Right? Like he did, as kind of Doug Ford did, he was kind of running against Trump. He was offering a very strong vision of competence, and I'll give him credit for a successful campaign in that regard. But in the Tory feedback loop, it was still really fuck Trudeau and fuck the Liberals.
Yeah, and they
And
couldn't get out of that.
and partly because I think for them and their base, that's what they want. Like if I'm criticizing the NDP for being a polling centric campaign, I'm criticizing the Tories for being an algorithm centric campaign. Like they're just following the shit that performs on Facebook or performs on whatever metrics they have, which is fair. I'm not suggesting that's not a bad strategy, but that leads to the extremism. That leads to now fuck Carney flags everywhere, which they are starting to emerge. And that's where I think that if they win, they're going to have the arrogance of the Trump regime and probably fuck up pretty fast. And if they lose, which I'm kind of expecting, I think they're going to be sore losers. And I think they're going to be the kind of sore losers who not only become an opposition, but become a conspiracy opposition. That their opposition won't be grounded in like policy or debates or tactics. It'll just be fucking wanker victimhood make-believe shit.
Well, if they lose, there will definitely be recrimination. And the recrimination could, in all likelihood, be much more vocal. And we've seen even in the last two elections that saw, in turn, the disruption of their leadership. I mean, very, very unusual and unseemly for the right-hand guy of Doug Ford in the middle of a campaign to stand up and skewer his federal counterpart, and then to Doug Ford kind of jump in and just say, yeah, if this guy was running his campaign, he'd be doing a lot better too.
Although, like, just briefly, what a display of viciousness.
Oh,
like,
unreal.
it just tells you that if you hire me, I will be the knight of the long knives kind of guy.
Well, and the Tory party has attracted a lot of those kind of people. I mean, the person who is running Pierre Poilievre's campaign, again, has got just a notorious reputation for just being a horrid human being. And so it's tit for tat, one horrid being against another horrid being. But the point being is that, you don't lose 25 points in the polls in 4 months and have everyone pat you on the back.
Yeah.
And this looks like, at least on the surface, that Doug Ford is kind of waiting in the wings to lead that coup. So there could be all kinds of upheaval if they don't win.
Well, let's explore that just from the broader political science and public opinion research side. I mean, there's two questions there. One, do you think Doug Ford would really give up the cushy job he has now to be in opposition? And two, do you think there is a kind of, for lack of a better phrase, sensible Bay Street, or, it's certainly not Red-Tory anymore, but where we keep talking about moderate Republicans taking the party back from Trump? Do you think that there are people having the same analysis that I'm having, which is the party is really going off the deep end here? They're being, taken up by these conspiracy nuts. How do we get the Conservative Party, that could actually be responsible, that could actually govern? I assume that's who Doug Ford is partly attracting. Do you think that could take place, in that I'm suggesting it looks like the conspiracy people are taking over the circus? Do you think it's possible they can be cut off before that happens?
Well, hubris is a remarkable thing. It certainly, blinds you from a lot of reality. Doug Ford is arguably right now the most successful Ontario politician in Canadian history. Mm-hmm. He's won 3 campaigns. He's not only just won 3 campaigns, he's won them by putting together a coalition that he and everyone else who follows federal politics knows you have to be able to put together if you're going to win. That is, you've got to attract blue-collar voters and new Canadians, which he systematically does. And the last 2 federal leaders, conservative leaders, have not been able to do at all. Wiped out not only in the 50 most highly densely populated urban areas. They have not won one of the most urban, densely populated ridings for 3 elections, the top 50. And this one stands for 4. How do you form a government if no one who lives in an urban center is going to vote for it, or no one, not enough to to form one fucking seat, for Christ's sake.
I definitely want to come back to that urban-rural divide in a bit, but please, you're saying in terms of the whether
No,
there is a constituency there.
and so Ford, he looks and he says, I know how to get those voters, those blue collar voters. I had 8 unions endorse me. Well, you know, I worked for the Progressive Conservative Party for 20 years. I never had one union ever endorse a party that was way further to the left than any conservative party right now. And he's very, very popular in the 905 and with New Canadian constituencies. So he's probably saying, and you know, ambition also is quite remarkable. Being the Prime Minister of Canada is a better job than being the Premier of Ontario.
Yeah, it gets you on CNN more.
Absolutely, absolutely. And he probably looks at that too. He probably looks at Donald Trump and the likes of those kinds of leaders and said, I can do a better job than Mark Carney in dealing with that guy because I understand these guys better because I'm more like them. Yeah. So, you know,
I may not be wrong on that point.
Yeah, I don't know what will transpire, but I mean, those are one of the scenarios I think that we should be looking for, depending on what the outcome is.
Yeah, and that he would potentially be endorsed and not in a negative way by someone like Olivia Chow, who really likes him and likes working with him. Again, well, is something that gives him.
He said terrible things about her before she was actually elected, but again, somehow was able to find accommodation. With her, and now they seem to get along quite nice. Justin Trudeau. I mean, you couldn't think of two people. Can you imagine those two going on a tending vacation together? Doug Ford and Justin Trudeau. Holy Jesus! But yet, all through the pandemic, there was kind of a mutual admiration society. So there's something about his personality. He's a very hard guy to predict. I mean, I did a lot of research on his brother when he was the mayor of, and you know, he was very easy to predict. But Doug seems to have a little bit more alacrity and a little bit more, you know, ability to maneuver.
Yes. And I think where both of them at their core are not ideological, they're retail politicians.
Yeah.
Like they have values, and these are conservative values. But I think you're right. I think Doug Ford's ambitions might be large enough that with the majority he has, he could pass it off to a caretaker without worrying that anything would happen to that legacy. And again, premature. This may be we revisit the future of the Conservative Party after we see the results that come out tonight and tomorrow morning. You know, where there was one narrative I was thinking about when you were describing Doug Ford. The other thing that could benefit him on the national stage would be the ultimate decimation of the NDP.
Yeah.
Because if the working class vote was ultimately up for grabs, if the unions were ultimately up for grabs, and Carney, you know, continues to play the kind of center right approach that he could take, again, that gives Doug Ford and a different version of the Conservatives a completely different way of engaging the national.
Oh yeah, and you know, we could go back to the polls. Is that, you know, all the focus has been on, you know, who would be the best prime minister or who would be the best able to stand up to Donald Trump. And Carney's got a huge lead on all of those kind of dimensions. Where he doesn't have a lead, and in fact trails Poilievre, is who understands what people like me are going through, who shares my values, all of these character issues. Now, those kind of questions also have the biggest none of them or I don't know kind of responses. But they certainly do not see Mark Carney in that light. So the vulnerability he started out with, that he didn't seem to be that relatable of a person, or at least I don't relate to him right now, hasn't really been remedied much over the course of the 38th day campaign. And so that vulnerability would definitely exist. And I think also just watching him, I don't know him, but just watching him, I mean, his instincts are technocratic.
Yeah, he's a nerd.
He's a guy who wants to find solutions through math, you know, and logic and rationale and research. And listen, that's where I come from. Well, but that isn't where the average schmo comes from. They come to those things through emotion and caring and devotion and you know, all these other more personal related attributes.
I think you're hitting the nose on the head, because on the one hand, this is the paradox of contemporary politics. On the one hand, this is the nerd's moment. That's why Elon Musk is the power behind the throne. But on the other hand, everyone fucking hates him.
Yeah.
Right? So the nerd has this mandate to be in power, but nobody wants really the nerd to be in power versus the jock, Doug Ford, who you look at, you're like, yeah, I could have a beer with that guy. He's a very potent threat compared to nerd Pierre Poilievre. A nerd versus a nerd, oh, there's no clear comparison. But the nerd versus the good old boy, different story altogether.
Yeah, I mean, Musk added to whatever kind of obvious dislike people would have towards someone who is like that by something we talked about right out of the gate, not understanding government and not being able to do what he set out to do. So as much as his temperament was not to be liked, or that his motives were not to be endorsed, it was his ineffectiveness in actually doing anything, or the things that he did, looking at and said, you fired all of those nuclear safety inspectors? Really?
But this may be ultimately the cognitive bias that got us into this mess, and the cognitive bias that I will keep making sure that we check, which is to assume that efficacy matters. Like to assume that competence matters. When, to go back to my point about the media consumption, your worldview, the Trump regime and currently the Poilievre campaign has their constituents in a closed feedback loop. Whether they can maintain that, I think, is an ongoing struggle. But insofar as they can maintain that, it gives them a certain amount of narrative insulation against reality. Because I do want to segue into the U.S., partly because, as I predicted, today Trump did post on Truth Social saying that Canadians should vote for him. So he did clearly indicate that he will be wading back into Canadian politics. And, he did a couple of interviews. He did an Atlantic interview, but he also did a Time interview. And both he is still pretty much indicating that he covets Canada. And he's using the salesman approach still. He's trying to explain that it's better for us. But I think he realized he fucked up. I think he realized that his intervention totally sabotaged the Tories, and he's going to have a very formidable opponent in terms of Carney. But at the same time, to fully shift, I think Trump's troubles are rising rapidly. And we talked about the empty shelves dynamic.
Right.
And I'm now of the mind that is going to happen regardless. And I say this because I think China is basically engineering a big fuck you. Because there's a lot of people who are looking at port traffic, both in Los Angeles, but more importantly in Shanghai.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of boats sitting around in Shanghai.
Down at 35% already. Yes.
Yeah.
No, and again, the New York Times had it's both fascinating and hilarious at the same time, but basically showing the inside of a house, and of all the things that you own, what percentage of those come from China? So, for example, like 99% of toasters. You just go, how is that possible? 97% of baby strollers. Yes. These sort of things, and say, well, it's one thing to say, oh, prices are going to go up a little bit, but it's another to say, I can't afford a stroller for my baby, or I can't have toast in the morning,
or that the baby stroller's not there.
Yeah, well, that's what I'm saying. I can't. Yeah. I don't have a baby stroller anymore.
Yeah,
or a toaster, and just the extent of the Chinese penetration against some categories, and they're quasi-essential categories. I mean, if you have a child, you need a stroller. If you have a kitchen, you kind of want to have a toaster. It's not considered a luxury, and that I think you're right. And then a lot of economists are saying, notwithstanding that it looks calmer now than it does on April 2nd, a lot of the problems are already in train, and these are going to come and hit the economy. And so I'm counting on still the prospect of a recession, whether there's 145% tariff on China or not, because these things are in motion.
Yeah, and I don't know if you saw the latest. To go back to my point of does efficacy matter? The latest shoot themselves in the foot executive order is they've mandated, and I don't know if this will actually go through because this is the kind of thing where it's so ludicrous it boggles the mind. They've mandated in an executive order that all truck drivers in the United States must speak English.
Oh, I missed this. Really?
Like that's going to devastate the supply chain right then and there. Like last mile depends upon trucks. So much in
Oh,
America
yeah.
depends upon trucks. And if you're going to mandate English, especially coherent English, as like they're fucked. Capital F. Like this is like such level. So I'm bringing this up for a few reasons. A, it strikes me that material reality becomes undeniable. Right? That when we get to the point of shelves being empty, when we get to the point of people being pissed off, that is a whole level of this crisis that either they desire and are anticipating, or, as I would like to believe, they are wholly unprepared for.
Well, in the weekend, again, go back to polls. I mean, the polls are, I mean, his approval rating is the lowest of any president at the 100-day mark in 72 years.
Yeah.
And he's gone down 11 points in the last 2 months. That's a lot in public opinion, an awful lot.
Yeah, no, it's weird. And to bring it back to China, I saw this infographic which showed global trade 20 years ago and global trade now. And it was a map of all the countries and who their dominant trading partner was. 20 years ago, it was overwhelmingly America, now overwhelmingly China. So if this is an international drama, an international contest, America's going to get clobbered. So where does that leave Canada? We ended our last episode sort of saying, hey, let's talk about Canada and China. And then the next day, the Chinese ambassador to Canada, who clearly listens to our podcast, basically made an entreaty saying, yes, let's make a deal. We would love to do business with Canada. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the politics, the optics, the way in which this could play out. Because I could imagine a year ago, 2 years ago, this being entirely verboten.
Yeah. Well, we started talking about this the other day. I mean, and now there's also additional speculation that, you know, if Trump is going to have a focus on the renegotiation of the U.S. Mexico-Canada agreement, it's probably going to be on the section that deals with if the other country has a non-tariff agreement with what they call a non-market economy, of which China, in America's point of view, qualifies because of all of the state subsidies of the economic activity that goes on there. The point being that the pressure will be on Canada and Mexico to align against China with whatever tariff regime or trade regime the United States wants to put in place. The point we were making in the last episode is that the best way to deal with that is to have a trade deal with China in your back pocket, saying, you know, if you don't be more reasonable than what we're talking about here, sayonara, we'll smell you later and we'll do a deal with China. To the point that you were just making, the thing that makes this even more globally kind of disruptive is that China's not having that conversation just with us.
Yeah. China's
having this with every other non-American country in the world. Not getting much receptivity from Europe, but getting, I'm intrigued, from every other nation in the world who's also scared shitless about these tariffs and saying, if I have to pivot away from America, where's the only place I can go? To China.
And who do you think right now is more resourced and more motivated, the Chinese diplomatic service or the American diplomatic service? Right? I mean, to your point, that is a huge disruption. Although, on the consumer level, and I don't know how the Carney government would play this, because I suspect they have to play a lot of this behind closed doors, because that is the nature of diplomacy and that is the nature of trade negotiation, especially with a partner as sensitive as China. But to put it bluntly, from the consumer perspective, China's stuff is just better. Yeah. It's cheaper. It's more high end. I want Chinese goods. I don't want American goods. Give me the Chinese free trade deal any day of the week.
A friend of mine in Mexico just bought a Chinese SUV, and
the Shark.
can't remember what it had. A funny
Please
name.
ask. Please ask.
Yeah, it had a funny name. It wasn't like that. It was the loose translation of whatever it was in China, but it was bought whole
Yeah.
in Mexico in Guadalajara. This I think it was used at 10,000 kilometers on it. He bought it for $20,000 US.
Yes.
We bought a used Kia with 90,000 kilometers on it for 30,000.
Yeah.
It was 4 years older, and it had every gizmo imaginable on it. And it was like, how is that possible? He says, that's just what they retail for.
Yeah, we are on some levels living in a developed country compared to some of the stuff that is available in China.
Yeah.
Now, granted, this is a propaganda campaign that they're doing because, to our point, this is part of a larger global trade battle. Here's another hypothetical that I'm saying more because I want to see it to happen than I think it will. Imagine if China made an extra effort over the next few weeks to make sure that their Canadian suppliers, like Canadian Tire, Princess Auto, all that, were fully stocked so that when America started to run out of shelves, Canada was just fine, right? That would be another very powerful move to say, you want us to keep it this way? Let's talk trade deal. Right? Because again, because I still think that
very
there's
intriguing prospect. I don't know if the system is that maneuverable to allow things like that to happen, but it's very interesting concept.
Because I still think underneath this is a huge xenophobia, fear of China, Red Scare, that unless this is really priced on the consumer impact, on making things affordable for Canadians, there's no way in hell either a substantive trade deal with China would be politically tenable, or B, it would stand up to the American campaign that would be done to make sure it doesn't happen.
And the xenophobia, as you say, is real, and it's ingrained, and it's long term. I mean, even Mark Carney, who isn't kind of an ideologue in the English language debate, when they asked, what is the biggest threat facing Canada today, he said China.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of a full stop perspective, and it's only gotten worse over the last decade. We mentioned last time, that it was actually a priority of Justin Trudeau's when he got into office in 2015.
Yeah. And to defend Carney in that regard, China is hacking our entire infrastructure and all our computers and all our government.
There's no question. Our IP theft is terrible. There is a state subsidization of industry that competes directly with non-subsidized industries in North America that isn't fair or right.
Well, and the big beef amongst the Trumpists is the currency manipulation.
Yes.
Right? That's what they see as fundamentally the most unfair aspect of this. And I think, if anything, where the hawks, the U.S. military hawks, have a very valid point, if there is any hypothetical military conflict, and it's their job to entertain the hypotheticals, there isn't reason to believe that America would win right now. Mm-hmm. And where America has certain advantages, China just has scale. Well, their industrial base is what America envies.
And I think that's not just your conclusion. I think increasingly that's the conclusion of prominent American business people, prominent American economists, and the more sentient people who are in the administration, who aren't simple lapdogs to Donald Trump or simply adherents to whatever he was saying. It was just going, well, I mean, that was it Ludkin or the Secretary of Commerce, who just said, 145% trade tariffs on China are, in his words, unsustainable.
Yeah.
And I think that's a recognition that, for all the bluster and all their ability to make the global economy go up and down, that's all they can do is make it go up and down. They aren't able to move it dramatically in America's direction unless there's cooperation on a multilateral basis with the rest of the world. Yeah. And that if they try to do that, they will end up being the biggest victims of this whole business.
Well, and that's where I think fundamentally, to bring us back and to kind of close this off, we to go back to my efficacy point, there's a lot of people who wonder, what is the logic of this administration? What's their long-term view? And that's where you get the Mar-a-Lago Accords. That's where you get Project 2025. But, and I had this thought the other day, and I'm going to float it now, just so that we can circle back to it in the future. What if we're just seeing the equivalent of the fall of the Soviet Union, which ostensibly was a devolution into kleptocracy, where the people in power just looted the place? Now, granted, that happened fast, right? It was a collapse. Maybe we're seeing something similar. It's just slower. Because it's not hard to argue that we are kind of seeing the decline of American power, the decline of American global influence.
And there's many who've been arguing that for, we mentioned Francis Fukuyama at the end of history. I mean, on the other side, you had a number of prominent kind of, I don't want to call them futurists because that's almost dismissive now, but prominent thinkers talking about the end of American hegemony right after the fall of the Berlin Wall.
And that's where I add the other part, the kleptocracy. That's your Elon Musk, right? That's your, and I say this without getting into it, but the antitrust trials that are happening right now with big tech,
right?
How they play out will be a real indication of whether these guys are successfully buying influence or whether there is still an independent state that, tries to follow whatever law its ideology tries to interpret.
And while they're infiltrating now into the United States, I mean, it also does, I think, speak to the motive of all the tech bros kissing Donald Trump's ass, because where the epicenter of all of this is in Europe.
Yeah.
And getting an American president to defend them as an American industry, against that force, which is, many would say, is irrefutable. I mean, the likelihood of Meta and Google, Alphabet getting broken up is every bit as high as it was Standard Oil. It's because it's exactly the same kind of monopolistic condition over something that is that important to both the economy and the security of nations.
Yeah. Well, and the one company that often gets left out of that is Apple.
Yeah.
Because what's interesting is even though they've evaded a lot of the same antitrust action, they are really the largest rentier in the sense that the iPhone really hasn't changed, but the amount of money that they extract out of their customers per revenue basis is obscene. Not to mention all the people who transact, the banks, the apps, the companies, it's crazy.
Yeah, no, they're culpable. There's no question. I mean, I wouldn't even want to guess how much they, get from Alphabet to have Chrome on their iPhone. I mean, it's just unfathomable what that is worth for doing nothing other than being, as I say, a complicit co-conspirator.
Although back to my, corruption angle, whoever ends up with Chrome, right? If, the government forces Google to get rid of Chrome, whoever ends up with Chrome, that's who tipped the scales of justice, because it is so valuable. That's the cynical side of how this is playing out, is rearranging the assets of state that exist in the.
But if someone else on the other regulatory side insists that Apple can no longer have those kind of monopolistic deals as they have with Chrome, then the value of Chrome is going to go down considerably, because it's all linked together in that kind of fellow co-conspirator.
Well, and that's where, this kind of becomes court politics. That you're sort of navigating. You're not thinking, what is the legal interpretation of this? You're thinking, how does the legal interpretation align with the political economy? And that's America today. It'll be interesting when we talk on Wednesday, whether our sense of the Canadian election plays out, whether your point about NDP or incumbency plays out, and the regional dynamics. I did actually, before we ended, I did want to flag the urban versus rural, because I think that's going to remain huge. I think in North America in general, not just Canada, but America as well, that is the dominant political tension. And it doesn't translate easy into ideology or into political identity. And so it remains kind of unaddressed, kind of beneath the surface. But I think due to the nature of the Canadian political system, I think we could see it very pronounced in
Well,
terms of how the results play out.
it is already. I mean, look at a map at Georgia on election night.
Yeah.
It's the whole thing looks red, except there's a little blue in Atlanta when they start blowing it up, and it's bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger.
I mean, to your point, that's Alberta too, right? Like,
oh yeah, for sure.
Well,
Increasingly, and in fact, if there's a surprise on the other side of the ledger, we've talked about the surprise on the conservative side, is liberals picking up seats in downtown Saskatoon or downtown Regina. Well, there's not many seats in those cities, but in Calgary, already, where in the prairies, and starting to see that urban-rural divide manifest itself in regions where it hasn't yet to this date, but that the underlying factor, which is dominantly education, continues to exist.
Yeah.
I mean, the people who live in Regina and downtown Saskatoon are way more educated than those who live in Kamsack, Saskatchewan, or, Prince Albert.
Well, and to your point, as much as I don't want to see this, I wonder if Northern Ontario could go from orange to blue.
Well,
right? Because historically, very NDP, but given the shit show and given that Charlie Angus is gone, they could be vulnerable.
In fact, there are really only two territories where you do see that kind of switching anymore. The NDP, PC, one is on Vancouver Island in the coast, and the other is in Northern Ontario. Because what it is, I don't want to be dismissive, but it really is kind of your tough loggers. Your tough miners, blue collar,
rural working class
men and women, but who are no nonsense.
Yeah,
nothing woke about them, that's for sure. And that it's kind of who's looking after my interests, who cares about the working man or working woman. And increasingly, the answer to that question is not liberal.
Yeah. Well, and not only that, but, the gun issue alone is a non-starter for these people.
Don't get me
right?
on guns.
And but again, it's the culture divide runs deep.
For sure. Yeah.
Deep.
Yeah.
Okay, another good episode. I'll be back in a couple of days with a sense of where Canada is heading and how America wants to respond, and hopefully some peace in the Middle East and peace in Ukraine. We can hope. Yes, we can. Thanks, everyone. Give us a rating on all your podcasts. See us on YouTube, and we'll be back soon.
Thanks, Jesse.